The snow fell in thick, unrelenting sheets across the frozen Ardennes forest on December 16, 1944. Sergeant Harlan Jessup huddled in his foxhole, the biting cold seeping through his inadequate winter clothing as German artillery pounded the American positions. 3 days into what would later be called the Battle of the Bulge. The men of the 101st Airborne Division were completely surrounded, running dangerously low on ammunition, medical supplies, and most critically, food. They had been on quarter rations for 48 hours. Tomorrow there would be nothing left. "Sir, the men can't fight if they can't stand," whispered Corporal Leroy Daniels, his face gaunt and pale in the dim light of their makeshift shelter. Sergeant Jessup nodded grimly, frost clinging to his unshaven face. "I know." When the division quartermaster had delivered the news that no supply drops could penetrate the weather and German anti-aircraft fire for at least another week, something in Jessup's mind had clicked. He had seen the rats, fat, well-fed creatures that thrived in the battlefield detritus and abandoned farmhouses. During training, officers had strictly forbidden the consumption of local wildlife, particularly rats, citing disease and morale concerns. The punishment for such desperate measures was severe. Jessup stared at his trembling hands. The men were starving, the Germans were closing in, and he was about to make a decision that would either save his entire platoon or end his military career. "Get Ramirez and Montgomery," he whispered to Daniels, "and bring those traps we found in the farmhouse cellar." No one in the 101st Airborne Division knew that one man's defiance of military protocol that morning would not only save dozens of lives, but would eventually transform survival training across the entire United States Army. Harlan Jessup grew up in rural Idaho, where hardship and resourcefulness were woven into daily life. Born to a wheat farmer and a schoolteacher, young Harlan learned early that survival often meant adaptation. The Great Depression hit the Jessup family hard, forcing them to find innovative ways to feed themselves when crops failed and markets collapsed. The difference between starving and surviving is often just what you're willing to put in your mouth, his father would say, as they trapped rabbits and squirrels to supplement dwindling food stores. By age 12, Harlan could identify every edible plant within 20 miles of their homestead and knew how to trap, clean, and preserve game. These weren't hobbies. They were necessary skills in a community where the line between subsistence and starvation was gossamer thin. When Pearl Harbor was attacked, Harlan enlisted immediately. Basic training revealed that his backwoods upbringing had prepared him in unexpected ways. While city boys struggled with physical demands and primitive conditions, he thrived. His marksmanship was exceptional, and his endurance on long marches came naturally to someone who had walked behind a plow since childhood. Yet Harlan's unconventional approach to problem-solving often put him at odds with military structure. During a survival exercise, he supplemented meager rations with foraged plants, sharing his feast with struggling squad members. The drill sergeant was unimpressed. "This isn't a nature hike, Jessup," the sergeant had barked. "You follow protocol or you fail." Harlan nodded respectfully, but continued quietly teaching his bunkmates which insects were edible in a pinch. "Military training is valuable," he told his friend Daniels one night, "but there are older kinds of knowledge that keep men alive when systems fail." By the time the 101st Airborne prepared for the invasion of Normandy, Sergeant Jessup had earned a reputation as a skilled tactician with unorthodox methods. His superiors noted his leadership qualities, but remained wary of his tendency to improvise. Fellow soldiers, however, requested transfers to his squad. They sensed in him something rare, a man who could adapt when doctrine failed. The Battle of the Bulge began on December 16, 1944, when Hitler launched a massive counteroffensive through the densely forested Ardennes region, under cover of heavy fog that neutralized Allied air superiority. 30 German divisions smashed through the American front lines, creating a massive bulge that threatened to split the American and British forces. For the 101st Airborne Division, the situation quickly became dire. Having recently been pulled from the front lines to rest, they were rushed to the critical crossroads town of Bastogne with little preparation. They arrived without proper winter clothing, with limited ammunition, and critically low on supplies. The temperature hovered well below freezing, with snow 2 feet deep in many areas. By December 20th, Bastogne was completely surrounded. Inside the perimeter, over 11,000 American soldiers prepared for a siege under Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe. When the German commander demanded surrender, McAuliffe famously replied with a single word: nuts. That defiance came at a cost. Airdrops became the only lifeline, but severe winter weather made such operations dangerous and often impossible. The siege was expected to last 48 hours before relief forces broke through. Instead, it stretched into weeks. Sergeant Jessup's platoon was positioned in a wooded area 3 miles southeast of Bastogne, holding a strategic road junction. Their position was particularly vulnerable, as the terrain made it difficult for supply drops to reach them. By December 23rd, Jessup's 40-man platoon had been reduced to 33 effective fighters. Their ammunition was at 30% capacity, medical supplies nearly exhausted, and food, the most pressing concern, had dwindled to almost nothing. Division protocol mandated strict rationing, half rations for the first 3 days, quarter rations for the next 3, and if supplies weren't replenished by then, emergency protein paste for another 72 hours. After that, the field manual offered no solutions. What the manual didn't account for was the brutal combination of extreme cold, continuous combat, and inadequate shelter. Men fighting in sub-zero temperatures burned far more calories than standard models predicted. Several had already collapsed during sentry duty, their bodies shutting down from the combination of cold and caloric deficit. Headquarters communications brought no comfort. General Patton's relief force was fighting through fierce resistance. Weather forecasts predicted continued heavy cloud cover, conditions that would prevent air resupply. And the emergency protein paste had been misdirected to another sector. Jessup stared at the division map during his last briefing. Their little segment of the line was an afterthought, a small piece of the larger struggle. The officers were focused on the main defensive perimeter, with Jessup's isolated platoon expendable in the greater strategic picture. "Hold your position at all costs," the company commander had ordered. "Relief is coming," but the maps told a different story. Relief was at least 7 days away, and without food, his men wouldn't last 3. By evening on December 23rd, Sergeant Jessup faced an impossible situation. The last rations had been distributed that morning, each man receiving a frozen chunk of K-ration about the size of a deck of cards. 3 men were already showing signs of hypothermia compounded by malnutrition, their movements sluggish, their decision-making dangerously slow. "Get the squad leaders in here," he ordered. 5 haggard men arrived within minutes, their faces gaunt and wind-burned. Corporal Leroy Daniels, Sergeant Frank Ramirez, Corporal Otto Schmidt, Sergeant Vernon Montgomery, and Corporal Jameson Walsh, each responsible for a small segment of their defensive position, each watching their men slowly weaken beyond fighting capacity. "I'm going to speak plainly," Jessup began, his voice low. "We won't last another 48 hours like this. The relief column is still days away, and headquarters can't guarantee supply drops. So we're being written off," Walsh said flatly. "Not by me," Jessup replied. "I've been watching the local wildlife. This forest is crawling with rats, big ones. They're finding food somewhere, probably in abandoned farmhouses and root cellars." A heavy silence fell. They all knew what he was suggesting. They also knew the official position on consuming wild rats in a combat zone. Army Field Manual FM 21-76 explicitly prohibited the practice, citing disease risk. The punishment could include court-martial. "Sir, with all respect," Ramirez began. "Rats? That's survival," Jessup cut in. "I grew up eating whatever we could trap during the Depression, properly cleaned and cooked. Rat meat is just protein, no different than rabbit." "The men won't eat rat," Schmidt objected. "They'll eat it if they don't know what it is," Montgomery said quietly. "My grandfather was at Meuse, Argonne in the last war. Said they ate rats for a week during the final push. Called it trench rabbit. Men never knew the difference." Jessup nodded. "I'm not ordering any of you to participate. This is my decision, and I'll take full responsibility. But I need to know if you're with me." One by one they nodded. What choice did they have? Their alternatives were starvation or retreat. And retreat meant abandoning the strategic crossroads they'd been ordered to hold at all costs. Within an hour, the operation was underway. They used wire traps found in a farmhouse cellar. By midnight, they had caught 17 large rats, enough for a small protein supplement for each man. Ramirez worked methodically, skinning and cleaning each carcass with the precision of his civilian training as a butcher's apprentice, removing all internal organs that might carry disease. The cooking presented another challenge. They couldn't risk a visible fire that might draw enemy attention. Jessup improvised using small cans of petroleum jelly from medical supplies, a trick he'd learned from a mountain man in Idaho. The nearly smokeless flames provided just enough heat to cook the meat when placed inside a modified helmet. When dawn broke on December 24th, Jessup gathered the platoon. Their eyes lit up at the sight of actual food, small pieces of meat mixed into a thin stew with the last potatoes and carrots scavenged from an abandoned farm. "Rabbit stew," Jessup announced. "Local resource acquisition." Private Wilson looked skeptical. "Where'd you find rabbit, Sarge?" "Don't question a gift from Santa, son," Montgomery interjected. "It's Christmas Eve." The men devoured every morsel. Despite the gamey flavor, there was no sign of suspicion or disgust, just relief and the first spark of renewed energy in days. That night, German forces launched a probing attack, 50 infantry supported by a light tank. With even that small infusion of protein, Jessup's men fought with renewed vigor. They held their ground, destroying the tank with their last bazooka round and forcing the German infantry to retreat. After the skirmish, Corporal Schmidt approached Jessup. "That stew saved us, Sarge. Whatever was in it, it gave the men strength when they needed it most." Jessup nodded, the weight of his deception heavy on his shoulders. "There are worse things than eating strange meat, Corporal, like watching good men die when there's food all around us." That night, as Christmas Eve turned to Christmas Day, Sergeant Jessup wrote in his field journal, "Official supply lines have failed. Found alternative. Men show improved strength and morale. Will continue as long as necessary. Some rules must be broken to fulfill the greater mission." Christmas morning dawned with unnatural stillness. No artillery, no distant tank engines, no crackle of small arms fire. Sergeant Jessup emerged to find the world transformed by a fresh blanket of snow and an eerie silence that experienced soldiers recognized as the calm before the storm. At 0900 hours, the radio crackled with an urgent message from company headquarters. German armor was on the move, a large concentration heading directly for their position. Intelligence suggested 2 Panzer IV tanks supported by mechanized infantry, at least company strength. "They've identified our position as a weak point," the battalion operations officer explained through bursts of static. "Hold them as long as possible, then fall back to secondary positions. Reinforcements aren't available." Jessup laid out his defensive plan, utilizing natural choke points created by the dense forest and the stream running along their eastern flank. They would channel the German armor into pre-sighted killing zones, disable the lead tank to create a bottleneck, then engage the infantry from prepared positions. At 1100 hours precisely, the first German tank emerged from the tree line 600 yards to their south. Behind it came the second tank, and then the infantry, spread out in textbook formation. "Hold," Jessup whispered into his radio. "Hold." The tank approached the narrow passage they had identified, a point where dense trees created a natural funnel. "Now," Jessup ordered. Three things happened simultaneously. Private Martinez fired the .50 caliber machine gun from a concealed position, targeting the German infantry. Corporal Walsh triggered a daisy chain of improvised mines along the eastern edge of the passage, and Sergeant Ramirez fired the first bazooka round, striking the lead tank's tread and immobilizing it in the exact center of the choke point. The effect was devastating. The disabled tank blocked the only viable path for the second tank. German infantry, caught in the open by machine gun fire, dove for inadequate cover. The second tank commander attempted to maneuver around, only to become entangled in dense underbrush and partially frozen stream. "Second phase," Jessup commanded. His remaining squads opened fire from concealed positions on three sides, creating a deadly crossfire. The second tank, stuck at an awkward angle with its vulnerable underside exposed, took a bazooka round directly to its fuel storage. The resulting explosion illuminated the forest with orange flame, visible for miles. But the Germans quickly regrouped. Their commander ordered his men to use the disabled lead tank as cover while bringing up mortars. Within minutes, high explosive rounds began falling on the American positions. The battle settled into a deadly rhythm. By mid-afternoon, both sides had taken significant casualties. Jessup had lost 7 men killed and 5 wounded. The Germans had lost 1 tank and at least 30 infantry. As dusk approached, Jessup ordered a fighting withdrawal to their secondary positions, 800 yards to the north. When they arrived at the abandoned farmhouse designated as their fallback point, they discovered German reconnaissance units had found it first. The buildings had been searched and stripped of anything useful. Worse, the Germans had specifically targeted their emergency food caches. And most devastating of all, the surrounding area had been deliberately treated with rat poison, a standard German tactic to deny food sources to desperate enemy units. Private Markowitz discovered this last detail when he found a dead rat near one of their trap locations. "Sarge," he called, pointing to the blue-tinged bait scattered around the perimeter, "they've poisoned everything." Jessup examined the scene with growing dread. The Germans had been thorough. The poison covered a wide area around their new position. Their primary source of protein was now not just unavailable, but potentially deadly. He studied the rough map spread before them. "There is one area they might have missed," he said, tracing his finger to a marshy lowland a half-mile to the west. "It's flooded this time of year. Germans would consider it impassable." "You want us to trap in a frozen swamp?" Schmidt asked incredulously. "Not exactly," Jessup replied. "I've been watching the water patterns. That area drains into a stream behind our original position. The rats there weren't feeding on surface food. They were catching fish trapped in the semi-frozen pools." It was a desperate plan. It would require sending men through contested territory, in darkness, through partially frozen swampland. But the alternative was watching their remaining strength wither away until they could no longer defend their position. "I'll go," Jessup decided. "Markowitz, you're the best at moving quiet. You're with me." At 2100 hours, under cover of fresh snowfall, they slipped into the darkness, carrying empty sacks and improvised fishing gear. The frozen marshland lay nearly a mile west of their position, through territory patrolled by German reconnaissance units. They reached the central section of the marsh after an hour of careful navigation. Here, the main channel of the stream had created a deeper pool that resisted complete freezing. Jessup knelt at its edge, brushing away snow to peer into the dark water. "There," he murmured with satisfaction. "Look." In the dim moonlight, dozens of small fish were visible, clustered in the oxygen-rich water of the unfrozen pool. Nearby, fresh rat tracks led to the water's edge, confirming Jessup's theory that the local rodent population was feeding on the trapped fish. They worked methodically. Jessup used wire from communication spools to create simple snares, placing them along the rat paths. Meanwhile, Markowitz employed a technique from his childhood, using a sharpened stick as an improvised spear to catch the sluggish, cold-stunned fish. By midnight, their sacks contained an impressive haul, 14 large marsh rats and over 30 small fish. But Jessup wasn't satisfied. "We need more," he said quietly. "This won't last long enough." He waded deeper into the partially frozen water. The cold was intense, immediately numbing his legs despite his wool trousers. About 30 yards in, he stopped at a cluster of dead trees emerging from the ice. Together, they began breaking branches from the submerged trees, creating a crude structure in the water, a series of channels and pools connected to the main stream, but partially separated by wooden barriers. "My grandfather called these fish weirs," Jessup explained. "The fish swim in through these gaps but can't find their way out. Every few days, you just reach in and take what you need." "Like a living pantry," Markowitz said with dawning understanding. Within 2 hours, they had constructed 3 separate weirs and positioned permanent traps. As they prepared to return with their cargo, disaster struck. The sound of German voices carried through the night air, a patrol approaching from the north, heading directly toward the marsh. "Down!" Jessup hissed, pulling Markowitz into the shadows of a fallen tree. 5 German soldiers emerged from the tree line, their flashlights sweeping across the marsh edge. They moved with purpose, clearly searching for something, or someone. "They'll see our tracks," Markowitz whispered, his voice tight with fear. "Take the food back to our lines," Jessup ordered, handing Markowitz both sacks. "I'll create a diversion." Before Markowitz could protest, Jessup slipped away, circling around to approach the German patrol from the opposite direction. He moved with deliberate noise now, breaking branches and crunching through snow. The German patrol immediately reacted, flashlight beams converging on the sounds. Jessup allowed himself to be glimpsed, just a momentary shadow darting between trees, before disappearing deeper into the forest. For over an hour, this deadly game continued. Twice, German bullets whistled past him, but Jessup knew these woods now, every depression, every fallen log, every patch of dense underbrush. Near the American perimeter, Jessup made his final move. He doubled back through a dense thicket, laid a false trail heading east, then scaled a tall pine tree. From 20 feet up, he watched as the frustrated German patrol followed the false trail, before giving up and returning to their lines. When Jessup returned to the farmhouse at 4:30 in the morning, Markowitz had already delivered the food. The mood was somber. They had the provisions, but believed their leader had been captured or killed. When Jessup pushed through the door, covered in snow and pine needles, but very much alive, the reaction was electric. Men who had been conserving every calorie leapt to their feet with shouts of relief. As the improvised meal was prepared, a stew of marsh rat, small fish, and the last of their vegetables, Jessup gathered his squad leaders for a final briefing. "The Germans hit us hard today because they know we're vulnerable," he told them. "Tomorrow will be worse, but now we have a sustainable food source, if we can protect it." He outlined his plan. Rotating small teams would visit the weirs every other night, harvesting just enough while ensuring the system remained productive. Meanwhile, they would create the impression of a much larger force through aggressive patrolling and carefully managed defensive fires. "Sir," Montgomery said with hesitation, "what we're doing with the local wildlife? It's directly against regulations. If Division found out—" "Division abandoned us to starve," Walsh interjected harshly. "No," Jessup corrected him. "Division is fighting for its life, just like we are. They've made the best strategic decisions they can with limited resources. Our job is to hold this ground until relief arrives. How we manage that is up to us." He looked each man in the eye. I take full responsibility for this decision. When we get back to friendly lines, you can all truthfully report that you were following your sergeant's orders. The court-martial will be mine alone." As dawn broke on December 26th, Sergeant Jessup's platoon consumed their unorthodox Christmas meal. The protein hit their systems like a drug, renewed energy flowing into exhausted muscles, sharper focus returning to tired minds. When the expected German attack came at noon, this time with 3 tanks and nearly 150 infantry, Jessup's 30 remaining men fought with surprising vigor. They held for 6 crucial hours against overwhelming odds before executing a planned withdrawal to their next defensive line. Radio contact that evening brought unexpected news. The German offensive was losing momentum. General Patton's Third Army had broken through enemy lines from the south and was now less than 15 miles away. If they could hold for 72 more hours, relief would arrive. On December the 29th, elements of Patton's Third Army broke through the German lines and reached Bastogne. Among the units finally receiving proper resupply was Jessup's platoon, now reduced to 26 men, but still holding their assigned sector against all odds. As medical units processed the besieged defenders, doctors noted with surprise the relatively good condition of Jessup's platoon compared to other isolated units. Despite their weight loss and exhaustion, they showed fewer signs of severe malnutrition. "How did you manage it, Sergeant?" the division medical officer asked during Jessup's examination. Jessup hesitated only briefly. "We improvised, sir. Local resource acquisition." The official debriefing came 3 days later. Jessup stood before a panel of staff officers, prepared to accept full responsibility for violating regulations on emergency food procurement. "Sergeant Jessup," the G4 logistics officer began, "your after-action report indicates your platoon maintained combat effectiveness despite being without resupply for 13 days. Can you elaborate?" "Yes, sir," Jessup replied evenly. "When official rations were exhausted, we implemented alternative protein acquisition from local sources." "Meaning?" "We trapped marsh rats, sir, and caught fish from unfrozen sections of streams. We prepared them using field-expedient methods to ensure they were safely consumed." A heavy silence fell. The officers exchanged glances. Jessup braced himself for the reprimand that would end his military career. Instead, the assistant division commander leaned forward. "You're aware that consumption of wild rats is explicitly prohibited by field regulations?" "Yes, sir. I am prepared to accept full responsibility. My men were following orders." For over 2 hours, he detailed the entire operation, the trapping methods, the cleaning procedures, the fish weirs, the rotation system to maintain a sustainable harvest. The officers took extensive notes. When the questioning ended, the assistant division commander cleared his throat. "Sergeant Jessup, under normal circumstances, your actions would warrant serious disciplinary measures. However, these were not normal circumstances." He shuffled some papers before continuing. "The division commander has determined that your actions, while technically in violation of regulations, demonstrated initiative and leadership that directly contributed to mission accomplishment under extreme duress. There will be no formal charges, Sergeant. Instead, you are being temporarily reassigned to division logistics to document your survival techniques for potential incorporation into future field manuals." Over the next 3 weeks, Jessup worked with logistics and training officers to document his techniques. His field notes were expanded into a comprehensive survival supplement that was distributed unofficially to unit leaders throughout the European theater. The document never explicitly mentioned rats, instead referring to small local mammals and protein-rich wildlife. After the war ended, Sergeant Jessup returned to Idaho, married his childhood sweetheart, and established a small automotive repair shop. He rarely spoke of his wartime experiences and never mentioned the desperate measures in the Ardennes. Like many of his generation, He considered his service a duty rather than a cause for celebration. But his influence continued within military circles. In 1952, the Army Training Command quietly revised its survival manuals to include many of Jessup's techniques. By the Korean War, Special Forces units received training in expedient protein acquisition that bore a striking resemblance to the methods employed in the frozen Ardennes forest. In 1967, a young Army researcher named Captain Howard Garrett became interested in the historical development of military survival training. While reviewing archived materials from World War II, he discovered the original unredacted reports of Jessup's innovation. Recognizing their potential value, particularly for units operating behind enemy lines in Vietnam, Garrett tracked down the now-retired Jessup at his Idaho home. "Mr. Jessup," Garrett said during their first meeting, "your techniques saved lives in the Ardennes. They could save more lives in Southeast Asia." The resulting training module, Extended Field Survival Without Resupply, became a standard component of Special Forces qualification courses. It included explicit instruction on the safe procurement, preparation, and consumption of rodents when no other protein sources were available. In 1971, a letter arrived at Jessup's home from a Special Forces sergeant who had been trapped behind North Vietnamese lines for 27 days with his four-man team. "Your rat trap design saved our lives," the sergeant wrote. "The instructors told us it was developed by a sergeant in the Bulge. They should have told us your name. Thank you isn't enough, but it's all I have to offer." Jessup kept the letter in his wallet until the day he died in 1988. The final chapter of Sergeant Jessup's legacy came in 2004, 60 years after the Battle of the Bulge. The Army Survival School at Fort Bragg formally named its advanced field training facility the Jessup Range, with a small plaque acknowledging the source of many techniques taught there. The plaque reads simply, "In honor of Staff Sergeant Harlan Jessup, whose improvisation in the Ardennes Forest, December 1944, demonstrated that survival often requires the courage to adapt beyond doctrine. His techniques have saved countless lives. What the plaque doesn't mention is the specific nature of that improvisation, that some rules, when followed blindly, lead to defeat and death. That victory sometimes requires the moral courage to break protocol when human lives hang in the balance." The story of how American soldiers survived the Ardennes by eating rats remains a quiet legend in military circles, not celebrated in popular histories, but passed from instructor to student in survival schools worldwide. It represents a fundamental truth of warfare, that the human spirit, when pushed to its limits, finds paths to survival that no field manual can anticipate. Would you have made the same choice? Would you have broken the order or obeyed it? Would you have had the courage to defy convention when lives depended on your decision? Comment below and share this story so others remember what courage really means. Not blind obedience to protocol, but the moral clarity to act when systems fail and lives hang in the balance.